Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share the clubs for January 2025. This is part 2. There are so many good things in all of the different clubs that I broke it up into 2 videos. So the first video, I used the die of the month, the large die of the month, the stitching die of the month, as well as the glimmer plate. In this video, I'm going to use the wax seal of the month, the clear stamp and die set of the month, the stencil of the month, the Betterpress of the month, the embossing folder of the month, and the 3D embossing folder of the month. This here is the glimmer, and it comes with Aura Glimmer foil, which is a gorgeous gold foil that has a holographic shine to it. And I love the fact that with Spellbinders clubs, you can pick and choose what suits you best, and you can choose which clubs are your cup of tea, because not everything is everyone's cup of tea. So you can pick and choose. And if you don't want to join a club, you can find things that you like and order them after the 10th of the following month, as long as there's stock available. This large die here, set of the month here, is absolutely gorgeous. These are perfect for spring. There's a lot of different sentiments in here with the Betterpress set, as well as the clear stamp of the month. Here is the Caboodle bonus. It is a stencil set that coordinates with the Betterpress of the month and helps to color it in. There's that gold, or that aura foil. Absolutely gorgeous. So I'm going to start with the wax seal of the month. And often the wax seal of the month comes with wax beads. This month it comes with that organizer container that I just showed, and it's a great way to store your wax seals. They fit in there perfectly with the flat side of the wax seal up, so you can see them really, really well. I'm going to use 2 different waxes for my wax seals. I'm going to make a few different wax seals and then just pick and choose which one works best for the project that I'm using. So the first wax mix I'm using is the pink wax mix, and I pick a couple different colors, put them on my heater thing. I don't know what it's called. These tools here, aside from the wax seal of the month, are part of the wax seal starter kit, and I use them all the time when I'm doing wax seals. The only other thing that I use with my wax seals aside from the starter kit are the silicone craft spoons. They're perfect for scooping things up, but I use the spatula-ish side on the other side, and it's perfect when you want to clean up your wax. I use it to get all the last little bit of wax out of that scoop, that heater, and then I let it sit to the side to cool, and you can pick off any wax pieces. And all those wax pieces that you pick off, you can save them and reheat them with other seals. So I've already done my seal with the pink mix. This one here has the pink with the purple mixed in, and I just love the look of that. There's a little bit of wax left in my scoop, so I'm just going to make one more. It's not quite enough to have it pool around the edges of the wax seal. So this is one that I won't be using in the video today, but I always like to use as much of that melted wax as possible and not have it go to waste. While the melting scoop is still hot, I use a paper towel and I completely clean it off. That way I don't have any wax left in there. You could always let it dry and peel it off, but sometimes it gets really, really thin and it's harder to peel off that way. So once this one is dry, and those wax seals, they tend to cool down fairly quickly because the metal of the wax seal stamp is cold. So once you put it into that hot wax, it does cool down fairly quickly. I can put those to the side and start getting some other things ready for my cards. So I have the clear stamp of the month here. Anytime I have a new clear stamp, I like to use a white eraser, and I use that over the stamping surface to remove any manufacturing residue, and then use a brush to clean that off. Now this only has to be done once. It only has to be done the first time you use that stamp, but it helps the stamp take the ink better, and you don't have to worry about it resisting that ink. I'm using a scrap piece of pink sand cardstock here to stamp my sentiments on. You can use whatever cardstock you want. And I'm also using a Misti tool here so that I can stamp it a couple times, make sure I have a clean stamping and it's fully covered. I have some embossing powder tool that I put on there because I'm going to do some embossing of these sentiments, and I want to make sure that embossing powder only sticks to my stamped sentiment and not the rest of the paper, or not oils that might be on there that I just don't know are there. I stamp it twice with some VersaMark ink just to make sure that it's completely solid, and then I like to clean my stamp off with a damp microfiber cloth before putting it away. That way I know when I go to use it again there's not any ink still on there. I'm using some gold superfine embossing powder. When I'm using or creating fine sentiments, I like to use the superfine powder just to make sure to get all of that detail of those sentiments in there. And then with that powder on there, I'm going to use my embossing tool to melt it down. Apologies for the shaky camera there. We live in an old house that doesn't have really good studs in our floors, and when people are at home and I'm videotaping and they're walking in the floor above me, that tends to happen. I try not to do it often, but with Christmas holidays, it was unavoidable. So with that that embossed sentiment completely embossed, I can use the coordinating dies and I can die cut that sentiment out. I do like to use some Best Ever craft tape just to make sure that that die is not going to shift on me while putting it through my die cutting machine. I will die cut it in a Platinum 6 machine. And that Best Ever craft tape, I keep using it over and over again until it stops sticking. You can get a lot of uses out of it, and it's just a good way to extend your supply of that craft tape. There's no point in using it once and then tossing it if you can use it multiple times. With those sentiments done, I can set them to the side. I like to do a whole bunch of my embellishments ahead of time before I go and create my cards. And that's basically what I'm doing by having those wax seals created and then my sentiments created. Now I'm using the stencil of the month. This is a layering stencil and it creates this gorgeous floral frame around the edges of your cardstock. I'm stenciling on Hammermill cardstock here, and I have my pieces of Hammermill on my ultra sticky mat to hold it in place while I'm doing my stenciling. Now I am picked raspberry for the first color. The brush that I'm using has previously been used for darker pinks though, so some of what you're seeing is the buildup of some of those darker pinks on the centers of the florals. I do start in the center of the flower and work my way out, so I get the heaviest ink in that center, and then when there's less ink on my brush, I will put it to the outside of the flower, so I have a little bit of color variation. I'm also tapping my brush on the inside of the stencil, the solid part of the stencil, just to take away some of the excess of that ink. I like to make sure that I can control the ink as much as possible, and by having the center of that stencil to take the excess off, I can make sure how much ink is on my stencil. Once I get used to how much ink I'm picking up when I go into my ink pad, I could go straight to the paper if I find that I don't have a ton of ink. But it's always nice to be able to add more ink if I need it and not accidentally get it too heavy, because if the ink is too heavy, there's no way to get that excess off. The second color I'm using here is Picked Raspberry, and I'm doing the same method as I did for my first layer. I am making sure to start in the centers of my flower so that that is where my ink is heaviest, and then work my way to the outside edges. These stencils do have numbers in the corner, so you know what order they're supposed to go in, but it really doesn't matter. You're going to create the same image anyways, no matter what order you do the stencils in, but it is nice to use it in those orders to put the stencils together. They go together really, really well. There's also registration marks in the corners to fit a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of cardstock, which is what my cardstock here is. Next color here that I'm using is Wilted Violet, and I'm doing the same method as the two pinks. I am tapping my brush off on the center of my stencil until I get a good feel for how much ink is going on my brush. Then I am starting in the center of the flowers, getting the heaviest of the ink in the center of those flowers, and then working my way out. By doing this, I can have a lot of control over it. And I love the fact that with any layering stencil, really, you can use any color combination and you can pick and choose what's going to work for the look that you're going for. I tend to be fairly heavy in the center of my flowers because I figure that's where the shading is, where the shadow is, and that's where I want the heaviest of colors to be. But you could also do it opposite. You could be lighter towards the center and darker towards the outside. Just really depends on your personal preference. For the centers of the flowers, I'm using the Lisa Horton Solid Gold Metallic ink. This is an absolutely gorgeous metallic ink. When I'm stenciling it, I find that I want to stencil it twice. That first layer of ink is fairly thin, and then by going around a second time and getting a second layer of ink, it just goes over top of that first one, and it makes it a little bit more solid, makes it a little bit more opaque, and I find that it shines just a little bit better. So I always like to do twice just to get as much of that gold in there, and it's a gorgeous gold. and it's perfect for the centers of those flowers. And it's also going to work well with some of the gold embossing that I'm using for my sentiments. The last stencil here is the leaves, and I'm using some bundled sage. I'm doing the exact same method as I've been doing for the florals. For the leaves, I like to make sure that the darkest of the leaves is toward the base of the leaf, or where that leaf happens to go beneath a flower. That's where I figure the shadow or the darkest part would be, and I always love the look of it when I do it that way. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing as I did with the florals. I will tap off any excess ink until I get a good feel for how much ink is in my ink pad. If there's an area I want it to be heavier, I can go right from my ink pad to that stencil once I know how much ink I'm picking up. And if I want an area to be a little bit lighter, I can always pick up the ink that's sitting on that stencil, because I know I'm not going to be picking up a ton of ink. And just like any stenciling, if after the first round I find that I want it a little bit darker, I can always go back in and add some more ink. So with those two backgrounds done, I'm going to take one of them off and set it to the side. I'm going to use that background as is. For my second stencil here, though, I'm going to realign the stencil for the centers of those flowers. And I'm going to use some Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel in the center of the flowers. It's just going to add that sparkle and dimension. I'm still going to be able to see the gold Lisa Horton ink underneath it. It's just going to add a layer of that sparkle on top of it. This is transparent glitter gel, so it just adds that glitter and that sparkle. You can see whatever color is underneath it, and I love using it for that because it gives you a little bit of extra texture, but it's not going to cover up any of your color there. Once that is stenciled, I'm going to set that aside to completely dry, and I'm going to go off and clean my stencils right away, especially the ones with that glitter gel on it. I want to make sure that that's cleaned off ASAP. I don't want that to dry on there. The next embellishment that I'm going to prepare to get ready for creating cards is the Betterpress Plate of the Month. These are two gorgeous butterflies that have several sentiments with it. There's 3 different sentiments, and each one of those butterflies, as well as the sentiments, have dies to cut them out. I'm going to emboss them with gold embossing powder to match the rest of the gold I have in the cards that I'm creating. So I inked that with some VersaMark ink, and then put some hammermill cardstock on the clear part of the Betterpress system, tape that in place, and then put the top to the base, put it through my Platinum 6 machine to transfer that image and that ink over. And then I can pour that gold embossing powder on there, tap off any excess, and use my embossing tool to melt that. Now, before I transferred that ink over, I also used that embossing powder tool on there just to make sure that that embossing powder was only going to stick to the butterflies. If there's any that is an area outside of where those butterflies are going to get die cut, I don't even bother to brush that off. If there is something in my way that was going to affect the butterflies or the sentiment, I would take a small brush to brush that off, but I didn't find that the case here. So I can just use my embossing tool to melt those. And I love the fact that with the Betterpress system, you can use a variety of different inks, and you can use embossing ink as well as embossing powder. So it makes it very, very versatile. If using embossing powder is a little bit too much for you, you could just use a plain ink and just use that directly onto your Betterpress plates, and then use your dies once that image has been transferred over. Once this is embossed, I can put my coordinating dies on there. I do tape them in place with that Best Ever Craft tape again, making sure that they don't move when I'm doing my die cutting. There's a little bit of a white line all the way out around the outside edge of it when you're doing your die cutting. And I just try to make sure that that edge is even all the way around. There's sometimes where I get it a little bit thicker on one area or the other, but it creates a nice edge anyways. So even if I haven't had it absolutely perfect, I still really like the look of the die cut edge. For coloring in my butterflies, I'm using that bonus item, the layering stencil that coordinates with those Betterpress butterflies. The first color that I'm doing for the stencil is that picked raspberry. All of these embellishments and things are going to go together, so I'm using the same colors with them so that they all coordinate well. For that first butterfly, I did my heavier ink on the outside of the wings. For the second butterfly, I'm doing the heavier color on the inside of the wings and making it go lighter towards the outside edge so that you can see the difference between the two. Neither one is right or wrong. It's just personal preference. And often I will just choose which one I want just depending on my mood. For these particular butterflies, I'm using the same color in the stenciled areas. So here I'm using the Wilted Violet, and I'm using a lighter coat of it in some areas and then just heavier in others. You could also do two different colors so that you had, say, the outer edges of the wings one color and then in the inside part a different color, blending out into the two colors. So there's a few different ways that you can do that. Once I have these two colors down, my third layer for this stencil is going to be that Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel. And it's just going to coordinate with the rest of the glitter areas that I'm going to do. And it's going to add that texture as well as that sparkle to those butterfly wings. Another option here would be to just use stickles, and then it has a nice fine tip. You can insert it in the areas that you wanted it to go. But because there's a stencil here, it's easy enough to use that stencil with some paste tools and fill in all those areas at once much more quickly. You're still going to need to wait for that to completely dry before using it, but it fills it in really nicely. So once again, I'm cleaning those stencils before I am moving on with my project. I don't want any of that glitter gel to dry on that stencil. Now that we have all of those pieces ready to go, I'm ready to start assembling my cards. So for my first card, I'm using the stenciled background that has the stickle glitter gel in the center of those flowers. It's already dried. I waited till it was completely dry before trimming it down to assemble my card. My card base is done with pink sand cardstock. It's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I have some lilac blossom cardstock that is cut down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. And then my stencil image, I trim that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inch. So we have a mat around each one of the layers, but it's a really narrow mat. So the focus is on the floral stencil border as well as my butterfly and sentiments. I can glue down that butterfly once the stenciled image is down, and then I also glue down that sentiment at the same time. For my second card here, I'm trimming this down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And I'm going to use the 3D embossing folder of the month, and I'm going to emboss my stenciled image. And I love the combination of the two, the stenciled border with the embossing over that whole thing. It has a nice combination to it. And it's a great way to just add a little bit of extra texture without adding anything to your stenciled image. It makes it work, or it works really, really quickly and easily, but I love the final look of it. So with that embossed, we can start assembling that card. So for this one here, I have some lilac blossom cardstock that I use for my card base. I have a mat that I made with some hammermill cardstock trimmed down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. And I just used some of that Lisa Horton gold ink and just smushed or swiped it around the edges so that the cardstock looks like it's gold. This is a great way to create some faux metallic cardstock, and it's going to coordinate beautifully with the areas in the stenciled image that have that gold stenciling in it. For this one, I'm going to use my wax seal, but I always love the look of the wax seal with some cord wrapped around my piece. So I'm using some gold cord, using the Best Ever Craft tape to tape it onto the back. And then once I have that cord where I want it to go, I can use my Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle to glue these pieces together. I use this glue for pretty much anything, and the fine tip on it means that I can use it for large areas as well as small ones easily. Liquid glue gives you that wiggle room unless you move and shimmy things in place. And I love having the freedom to be able to do that. Once this is down, I'm using some acrylic blocks to hold that nice and flat while I work on the rest of it. That way I don't have to sit there holding it down. And because of the dimension of that cord, I do have 2 blocks here. I have one on the top, one on the bottom, just to make sure that those are nice and flat. And then I'm using that Barely Art glue as well to glue down my wax seal. Being fairly liberal with it, I want to make sure that I've got a lot in contact with that wax seal as well as the paper below it. Then I used my stamped and embossed sentiment. This one I created off screen, and I did it the same as I did the one that was on the pink sand cardstock. And it was embossed with that gold embossing powder as well. So it completely coordinates with the gold on that was in the stenciled image, as well as the gold around the outside, the gold cord, so it coordinates beautifully. For my next card, I'm going to use the embossing folder of the month for my background. I have a white piece of hammermill cardstock here. This one is trimmed down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. And this is a nice all over pattern for an embossed background. I didn't do anything to the embossing folder while I was embossing it, but I do want to add some color to it. So I'm going to create an ombre look here. I'm using the Spun Sugar Distress ink, and I'm using some Spellbinders ink blending brushes. These are nice and big, and they're great for doing backgrounds, and you can really easily create some ombre looks with them. So for this first color here, I'm going about 3/4 of the way up, making sure it kind of fades into nothing. Then I'm taking the Spun Sugar and I'm going to go about 1/2 of the way up and fading that into the Spun Sugar. And then lastly, I'm using the Wilted Violet and going about 1/4 of the way up, blending that into the picked raspberry, making sure that I don't have any harsh lines. With this background done, I want to tie in that gold again. So I'm taking that Lisa Horton gold pad and I'm just running the edge of my cardstock along the outside edge of that embossed piece here. Now, you're not going to get a perfectly even line when you do this. Some areas are going to be thicker, some are going to be thinner, and I like the look of that. Because this pad is a foam pad, it doesn't have a rigid edge to it, so it's a little bit harder to be completely pristine and get a perfect edge to it, but I like the look of something that's not quite perfect. My card base is once again that pink sand cardstock, and then my mat is that Lilac Blossom trimmed to 4 1/8 inch by 5 3/8 inch, and now I can put my inked background on top of it, and I love how they all coordinate well together. Once again, I'm using another one of those butterflies. This time I'm going to use that sentiment that was done on the pink sand cardstock with that gold embossing powder. So once I have everything laid out and I know where I'm going to put anything, I can use that Barely Art glue and glue that in place. When you're gluing on top of an embossed background, I like to be fairly liberal with the glue, making sure that it's going to be in areas that are going to have contact with the raised part of that background to make sure that it's nice and secure. Then I put my large acrylic block on there just to hold it nice and flat while that glue sets and dries. For the last step for this card, I'm using some glossy accents on some of the areas. I'm using it on the body center as well as the ends of the antenna, and then a few dots on some of the details of those butterfly wings. This is going to add an area that has some gloss to it as well as some dimension, and it just gives it a little bit of extra texture. There's a lot of texture in the background as well as the embossing as well as the glitter gel on there. So it just adds yet another bit of texture to it, and I love the look of that with that whole card base. For my last card here, I'm once again going to pull out the 3D embossing folder of the month. This is going to be a very, very quick and simple card. I used some gold Lisa Horton ink on my mat, which is trimmed down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. My pink sand cardstock here is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and then I'm using it in that embossing folder. Now, I did find when I trimmed my cardstock down for this video and then embossed it, I did find that it ended up being a little bit shorter top to bottom than side to side. So I would suggest embossing your cardstock first and then trimming it if you wanted it to be absolutely pristine. The first time I noticed it on one of the cards, I thought maybe I had made an error in my trimming, but then I realized as I was going along, it was happening every single time I was using this particular embossing folder. So just be aware of that. I took my sticky mat out again and I wanted to add a little bit of ink blending around the edges, so I did that with the picked raspberry. And then I wanted to tie in that gold on the top and make the lattice or the pattern of this embossing folder look gold. So I just lightly rubbed it on the top, making sure to only hit the upper areas of that embossing. Next, I want to create a sentiment for this card because this was a card that I hadn't necessarily planned from the beginning. I had kind of an idea of something else I wanted to do, but I didn't have the whole thing in my head. So I'm using the Smile stamp from the Clear Stamp of the Month. I am inking it with that Lisa Horton Gold ink, and then I'm going to die cut it. You could use the VersaMark ink and then do the embossing, but I wanted to share just an alternative with you for this. The Lisa Horton Gold ink, you can stamp with it. However, I do find that really fine sentiments, it ends up being just a little bit, it looks a little bit blotchy. It doesn't have a completely solid look to it, but I felt that it was going to be okay for the Smile sentiment because it's a little bit larger. So I did stamp it multiple times just to make sure to have it so that it could kind of even itself out. Once I die cut that Smile, I also took that Smile die cut and die cut some extras out of the hammer mill scrap that I had here. And I'm going to layer them on top of each other just to give that sentiment a little bit of extra dimension. So I did two extra die cuts, so I have 3 altogether. And I'm going to glue them together with that Barely Art glue and just have them stacked on top of each other. This is one of those things that isn't absolutely necessary, but because there's going to be dimension in that background, I'm going to use my other wax seal for this card. So there's going to be dimension with that as well as with my cord that's wrapped around it. I figured I wanted to create a little bit of dimension for my style sentiment for this. So by stacking those on there, it just creates a little bit more of a substantial sentiment. It just gives it a little bit of extra depth to it. Now I'm ready to assemble my card. So I have my white card base here. I am putting the mat on there, putting my acrylic block on there just to hold that in place while I'm working on the next step. I'm going to once again wrap some gold cord around my piece here. And I'm using gold cord because it coordinates with all of the gold that I'm using here, but you can do it in whatever color you want. If you wanted a different metallic or a different type of cord, that would work as well. Using that Best Ever Craft tape to tie or to hold the cord in place on the back to tape it in place. And then I'm using my glue to glue this backing or this background down onto my card. Once it's had a few moments to dry, I can glue on my wax seal. Now this is the wax seal that was done with the pink mix. The other one that I did or that I used was the one that had the purple mixed in with the pink mix. So it has some purple with it as well as the pink. This one just has the pink with a touch of the gold. So it's going to blend in with the rest of the gold that I have on the card here. Once I put that sentiment down, I'll put my acrylic block on there once again to hold that in place, just to make sure it has some good contact with the embossed background. For this one, I'm using a gold Posca pen just to highlight some of the gold in the flower and just to make that flower stand out a little bit. And again, those are going to tie in with the rest of the gold elements that I have here. I'll let that completely dry, and here's the finished sample. Again, it's a super simple card, but it looks a little bit more complicated. And I used a wax seal here, but you could easily use a die cut embellishment instead of that wax seal. You could create your own faux wax seal as well. Then we have our background here with the ombre as well as the 3D or the embossing folder background, and then our gorgeous stenciled as well as 3D embossed background with that wax seal on there. And then finally our first card here. I absolutely love that stenciled border around the outside edge. I think it complements everything so beautifully, and you could easily do that stenciled background and just have a sentiment in the middle. I think that would be gorgeous as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me, and I hope you have a fantastic day.